why is this so important, right? If I can write about my product, or if I can sketch it or draw it, isn't that enough? And the answer is definitely no, right? So as we explore the physical model and iterate upon that, you're both going to learn a lot about your product and be able to communicate that so much more effectively to your user group. And so take the time to like enjoy that creative process in the prototyping space. That's why we do this, right? It's not just because it's an assignment. It's really important to what we do. And I think the second, or maybe even the first biggest question I get is, what does medium fidelity prototype mean, right? Like, what level are we trying to achieve for Monday? And so everything you've done up to now has been low fidelity, right? So it's a lot of drawing on a form. It's, you know, pretty flat, even though it's a 3D prototype, it's pretty flat. And for Monday, we really want to break into depth, materiality, actual scale of the product, right? That's going to be really important in medium fidelity. And while we're not getting to high fidelity in this studio, I want to make sure that y'all are clear that this is the only time that that's going to happen. So if you stick with ePod, you're always going to finish a semester with a high fidelity prototype. And the difference there is that it's going to be usable. It's going to be a more realistic material through 3D printing or kind of other processes. So medium fidelity is kind of that last step before we break into that realm. So I'm just going to start here with the basics. For those of you that don't know, these are kind of your three essentials. Cutting mat, a straight edge, a metal straight edge, right? Not plastic, and then some kind of X-Acto knife. I use kind of like a bigger box cutter, but if you have like one of the smaller ones like this, whatever works for you, just kind of feel it out. But try and get away from like scissors and all that. Using a metal straight edge is kind of really the only right way to get the clean, crisp edge that I'm going to talk about later. And then materials. And so feel free to hop in here with any questions if you guys have something more specific, just unmute yourself. But each material that you kind of have in your repertoire has its give and takes, right? Cardboard is super easy to work with, but it's really challenging to get something that looks crisp and clean out of it, right? So be aware of that. If you're just spending hours trying to get a crisp, perfect cut on cardboard, that's where you might want to move into something like chipboard. That's a little bit stronger and sturdier. You're going to get a cleaner edge. A lot of you have expressed interest in moving into wood. The two types of wood that I would only really recommend right now are bass and balsa wood. Those are the only kinds of like craft wood that are soft enough to really work with hand tools on. Anything beyond that, like a hardwood or anything more substantial, is kind of beyond the scope of this project. So stick with like micro lumber. Paper can be great if used effectively and in a clean way. And then a lot of you have asked about clay. So clay is acceptable from the professors I've talked to, but make sure it's something that's going to harden, right? So don't make it out of Play-Doh or like that like air foam stuff that Crayola makes, right? Use something that's bakeable and is going to set up. And really only use clay if you're working with organic forms. So I know some of you are working with handles or something that's supposed to like fit in your hand really nicely. That's a great use of clay, right? Because you can kind of mold it to your hand. And then have fun with it, right? Like if there's a press button on your product, find a bottle cap or a clothes button or something else that can kind of mimic that in a 3D space. Are there any questions on material use that y'all have? No? Okay. Basic tips and tricks that I've learned just kind of through the studio experience. Please, please, please change your blades. If you have an X-Acto knife where you can change out the blades, they get dull really quick. the easiest way to hurt yourself, and yes, it does happen, is by using a dull blade, right? Because you're gonna have to press 10 times harder, and then you're gonna slip and you could cut yourself, and that's just, yeah, you don't want that. And you're also not gonna get as good of a cut if your blades are dull. Um, please don't use tape unless it serves a specific purpose, right? So if you're trying to convey a use of texture, or if there's some specific example where tape is important, you know, you can use it, but other than that, we really need to be using glue. And with that, less is more, right? If you're using tacky glue or Sobo, um, that stuff's really strong, and if you just dump it on your model, it's gonna make cardboard wilt and weather. Same with paper, and it's gonna look terrible. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. Use a metal straight edge. I've been getting a lot of questions about, you know, how do I make everything look crisp and clean? If you use a plastic straight edge, you're gonna cut into it. You're gonna destroy your straight edge. It's not worth it. And then the old time rule of measure twice and cut once, right? Make sure you know what you're gonna do before you cut it. You could, you know, if you mess up a cut, you could waste a whole sheet of material, right? And that's just a headache you can save yourself. Gotten this question a lot as well for cutting techniques. If it's a straight line, be patient, use a straight edge, obviously, and go over the cut twice, 3 times, 4 times. Don't try and get it through on the first time. That's where you're going to get the cardboard to kind of like shred, or the chipboard to shred. And then this technique on the right, I learned my freshman year for cutting curves. It's actually been the best way I've experienced when working with handmade models. So does that make sense? Kind of that cut diagram? Does that not make sense to anyone? Right. So you're not going to get a perfect curve on it, but you're going to get like pretty darn close. And then you can take sandpaper and really refine it. But if you're fighting yourself trying to like do that all in one cut, it's never going to turn out to look good. It's just not. So take that lesson to heart, please. This might seem a little rudimentary, but it's really important. If you dump glue on your model, the professors are going to see that and you will get docked. So don't squeeze it out of the bottle. Put it on some cardboard, find a stick or whatever, and use that. And you really only need a couple of dots. The less kind of moisture you can put into your model, the better. It's really important, even though it might seem like a small thing. Getting into the do's and don'ts here. This is a difference. On the right, I used a ton of glue and scissors, right? So the cardboard soaked it up, and you can see the corrugation. It looks terrible. I used scissors, and the cuts, again, look terrible, and I didn't match up any of my edges. The example on the left took maybe 30 seconds more for me to make, right? But I used a sharp X-Acto blade, a couple dots of glue, and lined everything up, measured it twice before I cut it. And so it's really those little things that us as the TAs are seeing in models, you know, like it's the little differences that can totally change how your model is going to look. And honestly, the grade that you're going to get. So take your time and really show pride in your work, right? You're not doing this. If you're doing this just to get a good grade in the class, you're kind of doing it for the wrong reasons. You're doing this to make something that you're proud of, and show off your skill and like passion as a designer. So make sure you remind yourself of that. And then creating depth is another really important thing here. The picture on the left, that's a low fidelity prototype, right? That's fine. That's where a lot of you are at right now. But creating depth and showing, okay, is it protruding in? Is it sticking out? How far is it sticking out? All that stuff is actually really important to communicate in your product design, because it can totally change the vibe of what you're creating and kind of like the user experience. Are there any more questions about the last couple slides? I know I kind of ran through it, but love to hear. Okay. And then lastly, this is one of the most important things that people leave out and kind of rush through, and that's photographing your models. So all the pictures were taken from a poster I took down in my room, set it on my kitchen counter, and turned the lights on, right? Like it's nothing that special. You don't need a professional studio, but take the time to set up a white background. Can anybody tell me what's wrong with the don't on the top right? It's pretty obvious.
You can see like glares and other things too, like the can.
Yeah, the beer can in the background. Please, please do not do this. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen people submit pictures on Canvas and we've put it up on a projector in class and they have paraphernalia or something stupid in the background of their picture. And that's a terrible look. So please be diligent and don't do that. And then what about on the bottom right? What's going on there? Shadows. Your shadows. It's super easy to do, right? If you're in a poorly lit environment, if you're doing it at night in your dorm room, it can be impossible to like get your phone and your body and your roommate like out of the way to take this picture, right? So take the time, set it up. Outdoor light is preferable. But even if you make the most beautiful model in your class, if your picture is bad, it's not going to show, right? It can kind of make or break. So make sure you build in that time into your weekend. Take the 15, 20, 30 minutes to make sure you do that right.
Hey, Will.
Yeah.
I was with some first years the other day, and they had a lot of question about scaling. Do you have any tips for that before we go into breakout rooms?
If it's like true to scale, include your hand in it, like holding the product, right? That can be really valuable for scale. But anything that's out of scale, include one picture in your final submission with a scaled person or chair or like familiar object in it. Cool.
And sorry, when you're trying to find those like that entourage, should you just like cut out a stick person, or I guess your recommendation for like
Yeah,
making?
so try and make it, it's tough, right? Because there's a line we're trying to draw between making it realistic and distracting from your product. So I would try and cut out like the silhouette of a person, and maybe just like shade it in, do something to make it clear that it is like an adult human, but don't like put hair on them and dress them and give them a name, right? Because that's just going to distract from your prototype. So try and ride that line, I would say.
Do you have I saw that Julia put her like favorite craft glue in. Do you have a favorite glue?
Do I have a favorite glue?
Or I guess any materials that you prefer to use that
Yeah,
like
so
more specific?
I use Sobo. I don't know if you guys know what that is. I just had it and I lost it. But Sobo or tacky glue I always use, and I think wood results in a really nice like final product if you have the patience to do it. So if you go, I know you don't all have access to maybe leave your dorms or wherever you're at, but McGuckins has micro lumber, which is like the little small sticks that are all squared off. And they sell balsa and basswood, and that's kind of my favorite to work with. It's very clean.